Welcome to Washington Watch with Congressman Walter Jones. Each month, we take a look at the events happening in Washington, D.C. and how they affect our lives here in eastern North Carolina. And now, here's your Congressman, Walter Jones.
Welcome to the April edition of Washington Watch. Today's guest is Congressman Manzullo.
It's Don.
Don, excuse me.
That's right. It's all right. Okay.
That's a good way to start. That's a good way to start my.
President Bush messed up on himself, so you're in good company.
Don is a good friend of mine, even though the first name I had it written down, it was Dan, so I apologize for that. But from the 16th District of Illinois, his district is home to Rockford, Illinois, one of the most densely populated manufacturing communities in the United States. He has served in Congress since 1992 and has earned a reputation as Congress's champion for American manufacturing and job creation. He is the co-chairman and founder of the House Manufacturing Caucus, of which I am a member. Congressman Manzullo currently serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Financial Service Committee as the top Republican on the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and the Global Environment. He works hard to level the playing field for United States manufacturers competing in the global marketplace. Don, I am so glad and pleased that you will be on the show.
It's good to be here. It's a real honor.
And I truthfully want the people to know that you and I have been friends since I got here in 1995, and you and I have many times talked about our faith. We both share a strong faith in God, and we also have a strong faith in America. And you come from an area that the unemployment is very high. Would you talk about that?
Well, we've got our congressional district sits right on top of the state of Illinois, touches Iowa at the Mississippi River, and then it's all of the Wisconsin border. And then we come within 20 miles of Lake Michigan. So it's pretty much the top part of the state of Illinois. Rockford, the largest city, is pushing 14% in unemployment. In 1980, Rockford's unemployment was 24.5%. There was more unemployment in Rockford in the early 80s than there was during the so-called Great Depression. A lot of it is because of the huge industrial base that we have. 1 out of 4 people who work in Rockford work directly for manufacturing. And that's just directly. So
Right.
you can imagine the tremendous manufacturer base that we have there.
Don, you have talked about, you and I both voted against the bailout, the $700 billion, and I know that you have had some really strong feelings that you've shared in the committee before those who made the presentation about the fact about this issue of credit. And you and I share the same feelings, but why don't you share with the viewers your frustration, which is very similar to my frustration?
Well, Walter, when Secretary Paulson came to us in September of 2008, he said that he needed $700 billion overnight, otherwise the world's financial system would collapse. And he was going to take that money and buy up all these bad assets, what he called non-liquid assets. And those included bad credit card debt and bad automobile debt and bad mortgage debt. And I thought, why should the taxpayer pick up that stuff if somebody's bought that junk, especially after having 3 kids in college and getting a solicitation for a credit card each day for each kid, and now the banks got stuck with those. I said, why should the taxpayer step in and buy that stuff? So we voted against it. And then a week after it passed and was signed by President Bush, he said, well, we can't use this program. So they got involved in some types of programs that we had been urging him to adopt all along. But as it's turned out, it's not the, I mean, just here we are. I know this is pre-taped, but here we are the 3rd week of March. Secretary Geithner's finally come out with his plan to buy up these bad assets, and the Fed's just going to print money to do that.
Don, that is exactly what I hear back home, and I think obviously you do in your district, is that people just keep asking, where are we getting the money for all these bailouts? And I say the same thing you just said. We either borrow the money from China and they buy our paper, or we go ahead and just print more money, and that just puts us closer to an inflation type situation, which I hope and pray, and I'm not speaking for you, but I know you feel the same way, that we cannot continue to let this country go down of printing more money, borrowing more money. There will come a day of reckoning. It's just going to happen.
Well, you know, Walter, you come from an area of heavily military presence, and know the importance of weaponry and the latest aircraft and everything. And when and I come from an area that makes a lot of weapons. They make almost everything. That's why we get hit so high with unemployment. But when people came to us and said we have to have the same ones that talked to us about the $700 billion bill, then they said, well, we need a stimulus. Didn't go through a committee. No one took a look at the language. Overnight, hurry, 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 hurry. Then we find out everything that's in it. At the same time, we have to fight to keep the F-22 program going. I mean, it does not make sense, because we're involved in a war in Afghanistan. And these men and women need the best possible weaponry, and
well,
Don, frustrating.
It is very frustrating. I have trouble back home trying to explain to the constituents of how they keep asking me, well, you know, I'm having a tough time paying my bills. I'm doing the best I can, and yet you guys in Washington, but not you and I, because the way we voted, so they're not talking about you or me personally. But those in Washington that continue to want to bail out those who fail, why are you rewarding those who fail when those of us back home are doing the best we can to make ends meet, and yet nobody's bailing out my company if I go under?
Well, when AIG got all that money, it's about $170 billion, they paid some of their debts, and they paid 100% of the debt that they owed to Goldman Sachs and some other people. Now, I don't know about you, Walter. I've got my retirement is a 401k.
Yeah,
I guess now it's a 200.5k, whatever you want to call it.
I think everybody's has reduced.
Yeah, everybody's has reduced.
Yeah,
no one's sitting there replenishing that. Of course, we're not asking for that. But here we ended up covering Goldman Sachs losses through AIG debt.
Well,
that doesn't make sense.
Well, you know, Don, you brought up something that I probably wouldn't have thought of, but at that time, that Secretary Paulson, before he became Secretary of Treasury, he had an affiliation with Goldman Sachs. Then he comes to work for the United States government as Secretary of Treasury. Well, then, under his leadership, I mean, he was Lehman Brothers goes out of business. And then, as you said, just a few months later, AIG sends millions of dollars to Goldman Sachs. I don't know. I'm not trying to imply anything, but it just doesn't meet the smells test.
You know what we need for people to make these decisions? We need these community bankers.
Yeah.
You know, the people that can sit across the desk that we've known for years, that make the farm loans, the home loans, the business loans, the automobile loans, people that you can look in the eye and who really understand what goes on Main Street. Because there is a big difference between Main Street and Wall Street. Wall Street has this short-term perspective. We've got to make money this quarter, otherwise, we won't get bonuses, the market will go down, et cetera, et cetera. Main Street says, we've got 30 years to pay off the house. And so we're going to take some time to pick the house, and I'm going to buy a new car. I'm going to take, take a little bit to do some research and find the one that I like. That's not like Wall Street. It's unfortunate.
Well, Don, it's funny that you mentioned that, because even today, when I was driving from North Carolina to Washington, I was talking to my staff, and I mentioned the fact that there were so many, as you just said yourself, very well qualified banking people from out here in the United States that could probably make an excellent Secretary of the Treasury, because they bring that common sense success that you just don't get from Wall Street. It's a different world. I'm not being critical, but it's a different world. And I think the new Secretary of Treasury, I hope he does well, but he's already made some mistakes that I think raise some legitimate questions as to whether he should stay or not.
Well, you know, Walter, this just goes to show how much Washington is out of touch. I mean, how you and I, you know, we're not fancy people.
No.
And we don't fit in this town. I still get lost driving around.
I do too.
And I went
It's
to
funny
school
you mentioned that.
I went to school out here 3 years ago, or for 3 years when I went to American University. I'm a graduate. I've been a member since January of '93. I still get lost in this town. And I still feel uncomfortable going into a lot of places because I can't relate to how these people think.
I'm the same way.
I mean, I don't, you know.
Well, Don, you and I are in touch with the people back home. I've never lost that closeness with the people of the 3rd District, and I know you're the same with the people from your district. And I go home every weekend. I'm sure you do, and most members do. But to me, it keeps us grounded because I've got problems, you know, with the family of paying certain bills, and you know, we all have obligations, and yet there is a mindset that you just mentioned, whether it's Wall Street or even some here in Washington, it's got Potomac fever.
Well, you know, it's the same has happened on the patent bills. This is now the 4th fight we're involved in on so-called patent reform. And we were told, it was last year, that, oh, you know, this is really, really complicated stuff. You guys will never understand it, you know. Just take our word for it. Now, we're both attorneys. I never practiced patent law.
I'm not an attorney, but...
Oh, you are? Okay. But I never practiced patent law, but I can read.
Sure.
And we put together that coalition last year, and look who was in it. Phil Hare, who's a Democrat, my neighbor from Rock Island. He is a tailor and a welder. Mike Michaud from Maine, and he worked in a mill.
That's right.
Cutting wood. They don't have college degrees, but they have common sense because they work with their hands.
That's right.
And they can easily understand what's going on in patent law based not upon the vagaries of the language of the law, but based upon the facts they know the importance of putting out a product with your hands and protecting it.
Don, I want to get on the subject that you have been out front on so many subjects because you have tried to help protect American jobs, and I want to thank you for that. And I've joined you many, many times and will in the future, God willing. But you have suggested accelerating the domestic manufacturing tax deduction. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah,
please?
that was, Walter, remember several years ago, it was a big fight. I chaired the Small Business Committee.
Right. I was on that committee, I think.
And that's right. And Bill Thomas, who's a great guy, chaired the Ways and Means Committee. But we didn't agree. He just wanted to have a huge tax cut for big corporations. And I said, wait a second. The law that's replacing it, or the law that's being replaced, deals with making things in America. So if you make or assemble something in America, you should be able to get a nice tax deduction on it. And he said, okay, only for big companies. I said, wait a second. What about the little guys? And so this huge war went on for about 6 months, and in the end, the little guys won.
Right.
So that even
Thanks
if your mom,
to you.
well, but you know, it was a bipartisan coalition. There was zero politics involved in it. It was just the little guys versus the big guys, and in the end, a lot of big guys joined with us.
That's
I mean,
right.
Caterpillar and John Deere. They saw the fact that if the little guy is not protected and kept strong, those are their suppliers.
That's right.
So what it means is that if you manufacture in America or assemble, because sometimes you don't know where those parts are coming from, you can get up to a 9% deduction from the income tax that you pay. That was phased in over a period of years. And what we wanted to do was to accelerate that phase-in to give a bigger tax break for people who make things in the United States.
Well, again, this is one of the issues that you have been out front on, and I know that was a victory that you and the many people that helped you, and you acknowledge that.
That was a war, wasn't it?
Yeah,
it was
absolutely.
A policy war.
The former chairman, who is now outside, he left Congress a couple of years ago, and very interesting fellow to say the least. I'm being very magnanimous with the words.
But a great guy. Very, very, very honest, tough guy, but he had opinions.
He was an interesting very interesting personality, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
But Don, I want to talk a little bit about where we are today as a manufacturing nation. What do you think that working in a bipartisan way, that with the new administration, is there anything we can do to help reverse some of the lost jobs that we've seen in this country?
What we've got to do, Walter, is especially at this point in the recession, we will never recover unless we restart manufacturing. I mean, for example, take the big three. All Washington wants to do is pour in money from the top.
Yeah.
I know the liberals go nuts when I say that's trickle-down economics, because they blame that on Reagan. What we want to do is we need to start a fire so that the consumer can latch onto it and want to buy things. So we introduced the bill just this past week, so that if you bought a new automobile, you get a $5,000 voucher that's waiting for you at the car dealership. Good. We went from selling 17 million new cars a year, and we're on track now to sell about 10 million. That's a loss of 7 million. Take that times the average price of a car is 25 to 28,000. So that's a direct bite of 175 to 200 billion dollars directly that Detroit is that car manufacturers are not getting. And if you extrapolate that times any economic factor, you're looking at $1 to $1.5 trillion in the economy. If we have this $5,000 voucher, you can go to a Chrysler dealer and buy a brand new Jeep Patriot, proudly made in the 16th Congressional District of Illinois. Instead of paying $20,000 for it, you pay $15,000, and that means that you can buy that car for less than $300 a month over 5 years.
Right.
Now, what does that do? Once cars start selling again, it replenishes the coffers of the state and local taxpayer with regard to sales tax. Number two, the people who work in the dealerships all go back to work, including the mechanics and everybody who works in dealerships. Number three, the people who work in the car factories go back to work. Number four, the original equipment manufacturers and the aftermarket people. And number five, everybody residually, the lawyer who has an office who's looking for clients to draw a will. But if you're unemployed, you don't think about drawing things like a will. So that restarts manufacturing. In the auto industry, we do the same thing in housing with a $15,000 tax break, not just applicable to new owners, which is what this stimulus bill did, and because that does not apply to anybody who owns a house now. And then you restart the economy. You get things moving again and people working again, and then the economy recovers itself.
Have you got that all in one bill?
No, it's two separate bills.
Two separate bills. Mm-hmm. Have you already introduced the
bills?
We
introduced the first one. The second bill, another member introduced, gosh, I can't think of who it is. We just signed on to it with the $15,000 tax.
I'm going to look in that for the good of my people of the 3rd District of North Carolina. Because
and look how reasonable housing is down there.
Yeah, well, I mean, in comparison, I mean, we've got many of my counties, coastal counties, and you visited our county before, you and your family. These counties are hurting right now because tourism has picked up a little bit, but the housing market is way down. So I look forward to having my staff to look into your bill and the other bill that you mentioned, because, Don, I'm like you. Anything I can do to help America. I mean, I've told people all the time that's why I vote against foreign aid. I'm all for helping a country that's had a disaster, but it's time to rebuild America. We rebuild America, then maybe we can look at helping someone else, but we're not there yet. We got to start rebuilding this country, and you've been out in the forefront on that.
Well, so have you, bro.
Well, I appreciate that. Don, again, I want to thank you for the many things you've done, not only for your district, but for this country. Again, you and I share our faith, and we believe that this country was built on Judeo-Christian values, and that we want to make sure that our children and grandchildren have a future. And you've been a leader many times on the floor of the House, and I've been pleased to be there with you some. I've been pleased to be there and watch you some.
You are not a quiet person on the floor. I mean, you don't go away quietly into the night. You know, you get out there and you pound those issues, and you're good on them.
Well, Don,
you do a great job in your district, Walter.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Shortly, those of you watching, I'm going to let Glenn Downs come on at the second segment of the show, and we're going to talk about some of the issues that you have called our office about, some of the letters that you have written. And so stay with us, and in about a minute and a half, Glenn Downs will be here. And Don, thank you again for what you do. Thank you. Welcome back. I'm delighted to have Glenn Downs. Glenn, thank you for being on the show again today for this April edition of Washington Watch.
Thank you very much, Congressman. As always, as I like to say, the people of the 3rd District of North Carolina, Eastern North Carolina, are not shy about calling your office and asking you hard questions and sharing their opinions with you.
Right.
And the number one thing that we've heard from at the staff level in your office has been what you and Congressman Manzullo spent so much time talking about. It's bailouts, bailouts, bailouts. And people want to know what in the world's going on in Washington, what in the world's going on with AIG. Have the people up here lost their minds? And so I think I'd like to, if you would, just to ask you to kind of step back into last year and sort of walk through the process a little bit. As these bailouts have come up in various forms, first of all, what's been your position on those?
Well, Glenn, you and I know we'll forget as long as I might live that during the first TARP debate, we were up here on the weekends, if you remember, and you and I took a lot of phone calls from the district, some from outside the district, and it was amazing that for that first vote, and I did not vote for the bailout of Wall Street. I'm like the former CEO president of BB&T, John Allison. I think those that fail ought not to be rewarded. But anyway, go back to the telephone calls. And it was running anywhere from 9 to 1 to 10 to 1. People just said, we are in a bad situation as a nation because we owe all this money. That debt's accumulating every day. And how in the world and why are you going to bail out those who have been so greedy that they created their own problem through greed, and you bail them out? And you and I took many of those calls because you and I talked about it on a Saturday and a Sunday. I never will forget it.
Well, one of the frustrations that people have expressed and voiced when they've called your office is a process one. They're frustrated by the process, and I know you have been too. Right. When that first bill that you were referring to came down from the Treasury, after Mr. Paulson and others called, you and Mr. Manzullo just spoke of,
right,
they came out with a 2-page bill.
That's right.
That just gave $700 billion to the Treasury Secretary to do whatever he wanted to with. And then that didn't fly with Congress, and it then became a 100 and some odd page bill, which came to the floor of the House and lost. Then it went to the Senate, which passed a 800-page bill.
Right, that's right.
And it came back to the House, and eventually it passed. Can you tell people, how in the world does that happen? And why is it that someone like Walter Jones just doesn't go down to the floor of the House and say, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker in this case, I have a bill, I have an amendment. How does this happen?
Glenn, it is a very, very complex issue of leadership. The Democrats are in the majority now, the Republicans in the minority. And what happens when either party is in the majority and they've got a bill that's somewhat complex, in my humble opinion, they forget those who wrote the Constitution. They just bypass the Constitution. They figure out some way that they can, behind closed doors late at night, that they can fix the bill, so to speak, and both parties are guilty of that, and then bring it back to the floor and say to the members, that we're going to pass this bill. Well, some people might say, watching this show, well, why don't enough of you stop it? That's the problem. We don't have enough. There are few that will vote no because we have not read the bill, we didn't see the bill, that's not fair to the taxpayer. And yet, the way the process works, no matter if it's a Republican or Democrat in charge, and ask the Democrats, if they want to force a bill through on the floor of the House, they can usually get enough members by cutting deals with them, pork barrel deals or earmark deals, and get the bill to the floor. And it's not a good way to get it done.
You have recently become a co-sponsor of a bill principally authored by Congressman Todd Tiert of Kansas, which is a no more bailouts bill. And as we're taping today, as Congressman Manzullo referenced, Secretary of the Treasury Tim Geithner is just now unveiling a brand new bailout plan of sorts. And people have called in, people with the internet, and people are very knowledgeable in the 3rd District, and they're concerned, at least in part, because Mr. Geithner, before he became Treasury Secretary, was the president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank,
right.
And he was the guy who invented the AIG bailout. And they're frustrated because they say, well, my gosh, I thought, here administrations have changed and parties changed, but the same people that were running the show before seem to be running the show now. And is that a frustration that's expressed in Congress? And what are you and your colleagues saying about that?
Glenn, it is a frustration, and it was when President Obama determined that Mr. Geithner would be his Secretary of Treasury. Many of us had concerns, but it's even grown since then, not only because of that relationship with Goldman Sachs, but also because of some decisions that were made that you've heard, and people watching the show have heard Senator Dodd's name mentioned. I don't know the true story on that at all, but there are just a lot of questions that I think need to be answered by this Secretary of Treasury, and it might be the time that, quite frankly, maybe he cannot continue. When you lose your credibility, particularly in an important position like that, then I think it raises legitimate questions.
I know we don't have much time left, but in the past you have talked and talked and talked about the foreign trade deficit, and you've talked about the implications of that as it relates to the foreign governments, particularly the Chinese, building up more and more and more U.S. debt. We owe the Chinese more and more, and the Chinese are now saying, hey, wait a minute, we're not so sure about the value of the dollar. What do you think? Talk a little bit about where we are with that.
I think it's a legitimate concern. I think the Chinese see that we're in a difficult economic situation, and they might try to exploit that, which would not be good for our financial market and our financial well-being. And I think we need to be on guard and be realistic about the possible threat. Glenn, we only have about 25 seconds, and I'm sorry. Maybe we can pick this up next time about the Chinese. But I want to thank you for watching the show today, and as I always do, I want to ask God to please bless our men and women in uniform. Let's not forget that we have our service people in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I close by saying, God, continue to bless America. Thank you for watching the show.
Thank you for taking the time to join us for Washington Watch.